Good morning. Beis, volume 3. We are on page 12. We finished the parentheses. We're discussing the different levels of schar, which essentially means schar mitzvah, the energy, the divine energy generated by a mitzvah, that there are two aspects to it. There's the maisa mitzvah, the action of the mitzvah, which is only in this world, and that's the primary, that's what we're commanded to do. And there's the kavanas ha-mitzvah, is the intention when we do the mitzvah. And that intention itself has two levels. Kavana, like he said, he brought from Tanya. He said Tanya Perik Memalef. I didn't have a chance to look, but if I recall correctly, I think it's Tanya Perik Mem, but maybe both. I'm not sure. But regardless, that there are two kavanas. One is a kavana kabbalah shel machal shamayim, that you do the mitzvah not just mechanically, like he brings in Tanya as well, but with intention that you're following what God wants. And then there's a kavana, what he called here, the language was, so that draws, he said, energy, that kavana is the drawing of energy into Gan Eden HaTachton. The other kavana, what he calls al pi hasod hapnimi sheba mitzvah, uba'aveda haprati shebachol mitzvah. The inner, so-called inner dimension, the inner secret in the mitzvah, and the aveda pratis, like shibud haleva amoyach, by mitzvah's tefillin. And similarly, that draws extra energy into Gan Eden Elyon. So in fact, a mitzvah, therefore, you could be doing three things at once. The action, and the action itself relates to Olam Haba, Sevav Kalam. So basically, be achieving three things at once. The Maisa mitzvah reaches Sevav Kalam, which is higher than the structure of the energy within existence. The kavana, Kabbalah Sel kavana, generates energy in Gan Eden HaTachton, which is one level, and the kavana, what he calls apisat primi, generates energy in the Gan Eden Elyon. Okay, and then he says, on the other hand, when it comes to without kavana, you don't have this hamshach, and this is, it seems, a chiddush from the Rebbe Rashab, because he says nira da hamshach she'er beGan Eden, because he wants to qualify what is the maisa of the mitzvah to do with spiritual energy in Gan Eden. So he says that you always have to have the action of the mitzvah. That goes without saying after Matan Torah. When you talk about Adam, and Avram Avinu, like we spoke about, they only had spiritual part of the mitzvah. There was no real action. So that is understood. So that, of course, affects and generates energy in Gan Eden. But after Matan Torah, today, we have to do the Maisa mitzvah. That's a given, but he says, like he says in the top, even though it's through the kavana, through the Maisa mitzvah, and the kavana alone can't achieve it, but Nikol Mokim totally hamshach about kavana she'im Maisa. This hamshach in Gan Eden is dependent on the kavana that goes with the Maisa. Okay, that is all about Gan Eden Mamalakam. Because in Mamalakam, there's a difference, as he said, between Ruchnius and Gashmius. And that's why, in order to draw down in Gan Eden, which is Ruchnius, you need Ruchnius. And then he said, Oidzais, you need a Keli Ela Oir. And Maisa Mitzvah is not a Keli Ela Oir. Maisa Mitzvah is not a Keli, because it's an action. A keli to the oir is something that's similar to the oir. So the kavana is like a container for the oir that goes in Gan Eden. Mashenkin, like he says, hamshachas ha'atzmus is dafke b'davar gashish ene b'bechinas keli, like we explained yesterday. It's not a keli. But on the other hand, the Maisa mitzvah draws elam haba, erein sof ha'seviv, is dafke the Maisa atzma. That was the parentheses that we learned, and that sums it up more or less. Just want to add one thing question was asked about kavanas. If you go to Tanya, Perek Lamed Ches through Mem Aleph, those Lamed Ches, Lamed Tes, Mem, 4 chapters, it talks a lot about kavanas hamitzvos. A lot of that, if you look there, this will be a lot more understood. There he goes into detail what the kavanas accomplish, and speaks about Gan Eden and everything else, more detail. Up till Perek Lamed Ches, he focuses on the Maisa, that the key is Dira B'Tachtenim is to do it. You have to bring it in Tachtenim. But this idea of the action which transforms the material world, that's only action. Kavanah does not do that. But then he says, after all the qualities of action-based mitzvahs in chapter 36 and 37, where he elaborates on that, then he says, and now let's talk about Kavanas HaMitzvahs. So there's a whole discussion there in those 4 chapters, and probably even further when you start talking about Ava and Yira, many different aspects of what the Kavanah achieves and how important it is. Obviously, without Maisa, like he says here, without the action, you don't have a mitzvah. But there he discusses it more in detail. Also, the difference between Maisa, mitzvahs that are Maisa, and there's mitzvahs B'dibur, which is like Maisa, Akimas Vasav Hava Maisa. So if you want more about Kavanah and Maisa mitzvahs, look in those chapters. Okay. But there is very explicit how without Kavanah, the Maisa mitzvah cannot go into Gan Eden. He compares Kavanah to the wings. From Tikkun Ezeir is the wings. A bird cannot fly without wings. And the wings are Ava and Yira, which is Kavanah, the love and awe that you have when you do a mitzvah. So Maisa mitzvahs can accomplish something, but it'll accomplish here, but it will not go into Gan Eden. They're like the wings. So as I said, look there and you have more explanation on what's discussed here. Just wanted to share that. Okay. With that, we're going to continue after the parentheses. The line begins, Aval Gan Eden Shazel Gilib Chinis Mamala Kalalman. So the Chlis Kavana Ima Maisa. Right. One more thing I did want to add. Yes, I said I would speak about it today. So basically, when you talk about Peishi Yisrael, he says, Malay mitzvahs kerimen. So what do you have? What did he say about that? 2 things. On one hand, they have mitzvahs, but because they're Peishi Yisrael, which means they don't have kavanah, they don't draw down energy into Gan Eden. Because their mitzvahs are just actionable. They're just technical. They're doing the mitzvahs, so they get something for it, but you can't say it's Gan Eden. That's what he said clearly. Elam Haba, on the other hand, Kol Yisrael Yeshlam Chelik Le'elam Haba. Why? Because Elam Haba is not dependent on kavanah. Elam Haba is dependent on the etzem. It's not about the giluyim. Peish Yisrael, sinners don't have any revelation. They only have the action. Elam Haba is not about the revelations that come from mitzvahs, which is part of the intentions. The ruchnius is the gashmi. So therefore, Kol Yisrael Yeshlam Chelik Le'elam Haba. Even those that are not revealed, like a Peish Yisrael, even those that you don't see yet, the revelation of the divine within them through their intentions and kavanas. Okay, that was the distinction. But then I pointed out, it does say in the Mishnah, and then afterwards, what about all those that says, and it starts speaking, the Kerach Ve'edase don't have a chelik ne'elam haba. Menashe, this one and that one. The Gemara talks about a bunch of people that don't have a chelik. So how do you explain that? So the Rebbe has a very powerful letter where he talks about this, that is about the elam haba, and many sikhs that the Rebbe speaks about when it says that they don't have a chelik ne'elam haba. So sometimes it's explained is because they're higher than a chelik in elam haba. And they're chelik. They don't have a share in the world to come because they have something that's greater than a share. They reach a higher level. That's one way it's explained. And then regarding those that really, because I say those that, someone that denies, let's say, Tchias HaMesim, so it says, he can't have a chelik in elam haba because he denies elam haba. And ein katega nasa sanegi, you can't deny something and then have it. You're basically pushing it aside. So the Rebbe explains that means that he may not have it in his identity, but somewhere the elam haba will get to him. It may not be through his personality. In other words, everyone at the end of the day will have elam haba, one way or another. Some will get it directly because they earned it. Some will get it indirectly, either through a Gilgul or through other ways, but it will come to them. Some will have to go through a transformation. So you say they don't have it in that type of, in their tzir, in the shape, in the form that they are right now, their personality, but they'll get it when their personality elevates to another state. I can tell you can look in the Igros Kodesh, volume 2 of the Rebbe, there's letters on this topic. Just wanted to point it out. It's not really relevant to the whole discussion here, but in case you have the question about what about those that says they will not have Elam Ha? Based on what he says here, it's an equalizer. Everybody seems to have it. So there are different ways to explain it, as I just pointed out.
It is known the Rebbe Sicha about Bilgon, the Rebbe writes so about Jerovam ben Nevat. As er is abgeschnitten, wer abgeschnitten, wo abgeschnitten. The Rebbe was crying so strong about that. And Jerovam ben Nevat, but still, like you said now, we don't understand these things. This is, the Rabbi is making it clear.
Right. Okay. So we're going to continue learning now inside. The line, as I said, Aval Gan Eden. So after the parentheses, he continues and says like this. V'hinei Amru Razal. Razal, our teachers, our sages tell us, say, Schar mitzvah b'hai al meleka. Ki'im ba'elam haba. That reward for a mitzvah we don't get in this world. Hay alma is referring to elam hazah. Only in elam haba. That's what the Gemara, the Razal say. So again, the reward for a mitzvah we don't get in this world, we get it in elam haba. U'kamaimer, kol Yisrael yeshlem chelik le'elam haba. Like the Maimon that says, kol Yisrael yeshlem chelik. All Jews have a part, share in the world to come. Afila Peish Yisrael shemalei mitzvahs kerimen. Peyud is Peish Yisrael. Even the sinners among Israel, who are filled with mitzvahs kerimen. So today you could say they don't get reward, but Kol Yisrael Yeshem Chelik Ma'al Haba, because that's when the reward comes. It doesn't come today; it comes in Elam Haba. So even the sinners will also, who have mitzvahs filled with mitzvahs, they may not get reward today. They don't get reward today. They get reward in the world to come, which we're talking here is not Gan Eden. We're talking here about. Well, let's see what he's going to say. What he means by Elam Haba here. Well, Bapastas, he means Elam Haba. He just explained it's not Gan Eden, because Gan Eden is a spiritual, and Elam Haba is the future, which is in the physical reality. Okay. The Tzarech Lahavin. And we need to understand. And remember, we didn't fully get an answer to the question on the top of the page either about Maisa Mitzvah and the Ruchnius. Like he said, even though the parentheses seems like he answered it, because remember on the top of the page, he asked the question, how do Gan Eden have spiritual reward on a Maisa which is higher than the Ruchnius? So yes, in a roundabout way, you could say that Taka, Maisa doesn't create Gan Eden, spiritual energy. Maisa is Elam Haba. But it's not that fully, the full picture has not yet been fully explained, but he's going to now explain this further. So he says, Tzarech Lahavin. The Hari Idea Mitzvahs, Meseisef Eya Began Eden. Through mitzvahs, we've learned, we increase and add energy in Gan Eden, in Gan Eden, Meseisef. Gan Eden has its own divine energy, Vayita Hashem Elikim. Like we said, Vayita Hashem Elikim, we learned in the previous page. Gam Be'eden. Mitzvahs increase in that. So if that's the case, Hariyesh Char Began Eden Kelema. So we see from this that there's already reward in Gan Eden before we get to Elam Haba. So what is the difference between the reward in Gan Eden and the reward in Elam Haba? You know, is when the Razal say that we don't get reward in this world, we get in Elam Haba, but we already get reward also in Gan Eden. So what's the difference between these two? Now, of course, you could say, didn't you just answer that in the parentheses, where he said that Gan Eden is the Ruchni, and if you don't have Kavanah, you don't get the Schar in Gan Eden. Whereas Elam Haba is for everybody, even if they don't have the Kavanah. Yes, he did say that, and the Rebbe Rashab knows what he just wrote, but could be that he's going over in more detail, and being that this was a parenthesis, it was almost like a footnote, that he's not bypassing it, and it's relevant to understanding it, but nevertheless, it's not uncommon that he could ask such a question because he wants to explain the whole big picture of it, even though technically you could answer what he said already. But he's going to go back to that anyway, like we're going to see in a second. So here's what he says. So the language is imma. And if you're going to say, or you could say that the quality of Elam Haba, what is Elam Haba different than Gan Eden? That Elam Haba will be souls within bodies, whereas Gan Eden is only souls. That's why it's only spiritual. L'cheira ma'u ha'yisum b'zeh that a neshama is b'lei gufim shenenem b'ziv ha'shchina b'Gan Eden. That is a yesa naila v'mashiyir neshama is b'gufim. So even if you're going to say that the difference is that this is neshamas alone and this is neshamas begufim, l'cheira, he says, what's the advantage of a soul within a body? It seems much higher than a soul without a body that benefits from the Shechina, that enjoys and takes and delights in the reflection of the Shechina. Is how does a yesanayla mashiyu neshamas begufim? It's much higher than souls inside bodies which don't have that level of divine spirituality. Now, of course, you're going to start saying, well, I learned elsewhere that neshamas begufim reach higher levels, like we learned Sevav Kalaman. Well, hold everything you know, because as we spoke, the difference in the Rambam and the Ramban is connected to this, where the Rambam says the ultimate schar is neshamas without bodies, because logically speaking, a neshama is limited by the body. As much as God wants us to come to this world and change the world and make a Dira b'tachtenim, a home for God here. But if you talk about pure firepower, where does a neshama have greater divine experience? In this world or in the world to come? So in the world, or in Gan Eden rather, I should say. In Gan Eden or in neshamas begufim or in neshamas alone. Neshamas alone don't have any issues, they don't have to deal with a body and all its challenges and health and mortality and all that. In addition to the body's needs of eating and drinking, like the Alter Rebbe says in chapter 37, he says in Tanya, that as high as a neshama, even tzaddikim, when they come below, cannot serve with the same love and awe as they are without a gufim. So b'pashtus, a neshama without a guf seems to be a higher revelation. Now, of course, we're going to learn that there's something the neshamas begufim have that the neshamas don't have, but he's not gotten there yet. So essentially what was said in the parentheses, he didn't explain the mila of gufim. He just said that Sevav Kalaman is for everybody. Gan Eden is not. But if you ask which is a higher revelation, you can argue in Giluyim, well, not just argue, it says L'cheira, the Gan Eden is a higher revelation. So just to sum up what we said so far, Razal say the schar is not in this world, it's in the world to come. The Rebbe Rashab asks, if that's the case, what's the difference between the world to come? Because you already have schar before the world to come. We already have schar in Gan Eden. So what's the difference between? And if you're going to say that Elam Haba is neshamas begufim, that just adds to the question, because neshamas begufim seem to be a lower level of a revelation, and to the neshamas as they are without bodies. Now he's going to ask another question. Going back to that Razal that say that there's no schar in this world, the Rebbe Rashab says the following now. And that very statement that you say that the Razal say that in this world there's no reward, we have to understand what that means. Isn't it the pasuk is filled with references. Shemat neschon shel mitzvos hi b'hai alma. Hu b'hai alma. It's not once, but when you say mikra mola dibra kosev, you're saying the mikra is filled with references that you do get schar in this world. And he brings it out. Kamosha kosev in b'chukesei telechu v'nesati geshmeichem be'itam v'nosna eretz yivula v'im loi tishmu v'hoyim shemeya uksiv re'eya nesati bracha. He brings a bunch of verses from different places in the Torah. When you will follow my rules, my laws, what will happen? I'll give you the rains in their time. In other words, the rain will fall in the proper way. You'll be blessed. It's a direct reward in this world. It doesn't say I'll give you rewards in the world to come. In this world, you will have a bountiful agricultural season. And the eretz will produce will produce fruit. Right. That's mikra mola dibra kosev. The im lo yishmu, he goes all the other. And if you don't listen, it'll be the opposite. In other words, the effect of our mitzvahs will be felt in this world. So why does it say that you don't have schar mitzvah in this world? And another verse. Uksiv re'ei nasati. Behold today, behold, I give you the two paths. Bracha, the blessing, that if you do so and so, you'll be blessed, and if not, God forbid. So that's yet another question now. Okay. The Gam Tzarech L'Havin. The Masha Amar Razal, we also have to understand, Razal say in another place, we say it every day, Elu dvarim sha'adam eichel meperasein be'elam haza. Va'keren kayemes le'elam haba. What does it say? Here are the things that a person will benefit from, will actually eichel meperasein literally means to eat from these fruits, to consume. In this world, it says, va'keren kayemes. And essentially, the keren, what do you say? Keren, there's the dividends, and the keren is the principle, right? And the principle is preserved le'elam haba. The chashiv b'mishnah heidvarim, and the Mishnah counts 5 things that a person will benefit from be'elam haza. It says it clearly, and it says, and just in case you may wonder, he says clearly elam haba. He also mentions elam haba. So clearly, Elam Haza has reward. So of course, you could say it's just these 5 things. So the Rebbe Rashab qualifies. The Tzarech L'Havin, Lama Yotzu Elim Min HaKlal D'Chol HaMitzvos Scharim Leka B'Hai Alma. Why then? Why these 5 things stand out as exceptions? If Razal say, like we said, that you don't get reward in this world, why these 5 do we get reward in this world? Okay, so a bunch of questions we have, not finished. So he's saying, the Mishnah, you could say, okay, 5 things, and other things are not rewarded in this world. But firstly, we need to understand why those 5 are different. But when you go back to Imbuchu Kesai, there's no qualification that says you only get reward for certain things. He says a general statement. Vade kol ha-mitzvos b'chlal. Imbuchu Kesai telechu, he doesn't say 5 laws or 5 rules or 5 mitzvahs or 5 edicts. And now he says, "V'haraya mikibada ve'aim shemat nschara b'tzida," and he brings another proof, where it says, "Kabedes avicha v'simecha." What does the pasuk say in the Chassidus? Leman yarichun yemecha. Leman yarichun yemecha is not noilam haba. It's in this world. It says, honor your parents, your father and your mother, in order that will cause that you will live long. He's not talking about arichas yom, that the soul lives on. He's talking about in this world you will live long. So the Rabbi Rashab is saying that's a raya.
למען יאריכון יומך על האדמה.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you see from this? That you're not just talking about limited to certain mitzvahs. So one thing we need to understand why the Mishnah there says 5. But that also contradicts the statement that says that you don't have schar. But there you could say those 5 are an exception. We have to understand why. But clearly from B'chukesei Telechu, and now it brings Raya from Kibbud Avim, tells you, like he said, Mikra Mole Dibra Kosev, that we do have reward in this world. So what does it mean to say we don't have reward in this world, only in Elam Haba?
Kibbud Avim is one of the 5, correct?
I don't think so.
Ve'elohen, Kibbud Avim, Gemilas Chasadim, V'haskamas Beis HaMidrash, Shachris V'arvis, V'hachas Orchim, Bikr Cholim, V'hachas Kalal, V'livias Mes V'iyun Tfila, V'havas Shalom Bein Adam L'Chaveiro.
You're reading from Siddur?
Yes.
I think you mentioned more than 5 now.
Yeah, it's another good point, Reb Tzvi.
Yeah, but he's talking the Mishnah here. I don't think that's strictly the Mishnah. That goes more than the Mishnah.
It says Elu Dvarim Sh'Adam Ochel Pertem.
But he says the Chashiv b'Mishnah. That what you're reading could be in addition to what the Mishnah says. To look up the source for it. I'll look it up.
There's a question why he didn't mention this one too.
Well, he says, but Mishnah Chashiv Hey Dvarim. Does your Siddur have footnotes there in the bottom?
I'm reading from Safari. I don't have my actual Siddur in front of me.
Okay, we'll look it up. I'll look it up. I'll tell you. Okay. Fine. So the question is clear. The questions, I should say. Okay. Before we continue on, does anybody want any clarification on anything here? Okay. If not, we continue. So we're going to page 1213. A bunch of questions that are on the table, which means we need to really understand what's the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haba. We know it's the difference between the Shamas and the Shamas Begufim, but what's the quality of Elam Haba, and what does it mean that the reward will not be in this world, only be in that world of Elam Haba? Okay. And as I said, the parentheses gives us some insight, but not enough to answer all these questions. So he starts like this on page 1213. Well, Lahavin calls that Sarach Lahavin Inyan Hagili de Gan Eden. To understand all this, we need to understand the revelation that happens in Gan Eden. What is that level? What is that revelation exactly? Now, as I said yesterday, and I say again, you need to have a lot of patience here, because these questions are not going to be answered so fast. He's going to go now and understand what exactly is Gan Eden in the first place. So we know that it is some type of spiritual energy that's generated by our good deeds. But we want to understand exactly what its personality is like. And he's not going to, we're going to go now to page 1218. He's going to go back to what Gan Eden is. So now there's going to be a good few pages here, 5 pages of explaining Gan Eden. Tehini Yadua. I will say just one thing before we go into it. I mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. In the first volume of Ayin Beis, when the Rebbe Rashab laid out the map, the whole map of the cosmic order. So I've mentioned a number of times, to sum it up, that basically the points he made there was that there's a difference between Pnimi and Makif, or what we're calling now a Mamala Kalam and a Seviv Kalam, where Mamala Kalam is the divine energy that creates and permeates existence. Seviv Kalam is like Ratzon, that is transcends existence. Keser. Ultimately, the goal is to join the two, but they're two different tracks. He called it later Er HaGvul and Er HaBli Gvul. We learned, of course, that language recently as well. the Mashamayim Mamal v'Aretz Mitachas. So Eir HaGvul is the Eir Mamal Kalalman, and Eir HaBlikvul is what evokes bittul, because it's beyond existence. There he explained also the difference between the Ovis and Matan Torah. That the Ovis were primarily their work was in the world of Mamala Kalalman, to make sure that existence was aligned with what God wants. With the sins that happened after the Chet Tzadas concealed the divine, Avram began to illuminate and bring the Shekhinah back into the world, that the world should be aligned with godliness. Matan Torah, on the other hand, brings a Er Chodesh, a Yichud Abba V'Ima Eloyin, what he calls, a higher state, a new revelation that's from Sevav Kol, from the Er HaBlikvul, which of course is very relevant to our discussion. Because Ein Oid adds the dimension that you're actually transforming the night itself, the concealment itself. But why am I mentioning Er HaBlikvul and Er HaGvul? Because in Chassidus, and he already referred to some of the Maimorim earlier in Ayin Beis, Gan Eden and Elam Haba are very much like Er HaGvul and Er HaBlikvul. So it's just good to keep in mind. It'll help keep us focused, ultimately, in the whole conversation of what is going on here. So essentially what he's doing now, which he has not done before, except in volume 1 somewhat, but not through Aveda. In Ayin Beis, he never really explained, after everything is said and done, as much as we learned about the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra and the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, and how B'Shamayim Emal v'Aretz Mitachas are finding Havaya Elikim, revealing the divine within existence, beyond existence. He never spoke about the actual dynamic of what does our Aveda do. When you do a mitzvah, we know it generates energy. But now he's going to be dissecting exactly what energy it generates. And this was, even though this has been discussed to some extent earlier in Ayin Beis, but to me it's very clear now that he's really going into that. So that's the real context here. Gan Eden is the word being used because it's the operative word to use when you want to talk about what is generated through our Avodah. But in essence, you're really talking here about the dynamics and the anatomy of what mitzvah really does when you do a mitzvah, what type of spiritual energy it generates. And of course, as we learned, it's going to be connected very much to kavana, to the spiritual part of the mitzvah, even though we must have the Maisa mitzvah. So I just wanted to make that clear, so to understand that this isn't just some tangent where he's going off to explain Gan Eden and Elam Haba. It's actually explaining the very central themes of Ayin Beis, but explaining it now in the context of our Aveda, what we accomplish. So he's saying, what do you have to understand? What is this Gilead called Gan Eden? Now, it also will enrich, or more than enrich. I don't know if you ever thought about it. And we talk about Gan Eden, that the Neshamas go to Gan Eden and they're rewarded, and they sit and learn Torah there, and everything that's happening in all the levels of Gan Eden. But Gan Eden originates in the first verses of Genesis, of Bereshis, that Adam is placed in Gan Eden. And when you think about it, simply on a very basic level, what is this Garden of Eden that everybody knows about? It's one of the most popular stories in the world. The story of paradise, Garden of Eden, tree of knowledge, tree of life, Adam and Eve. They sin, the serpent, good and evil, and then they are banished. But without really Chassidus, what we're going to learn now, you don't really understand what is this Gan Eden anyway. What is this Gan Eden? God created the entire world. He wanted the whole world to become a home for God. So what is this special place called Gan Eden that he put Adam and Eve there? Where he put Adam and Chava. So yes, on a technical level, you could say he put them in a very beautiful part of the world and said, do what you have to do. But what about the rest of the world? So we learned already that Gan Eden is a higher state than all the worlds around it, than the whole world around it and all the spiritual worlds. But what does it really consist of? What exactly is the mahus of Gan Eden in general? What is it? What type of state of consciousness existed there? And that's what we're going to be learning now. The state of consciousness of Gan Eden Gashmi, when Adam and Chava were there, and Gan Eden Ruchni, which is right now the Gan Eden where Neshamas reside and dwell and live. So we're really coming to understand now the spiritual state of Gan Eden, which we call Gan Eden. And of course, it'll broaden Gan Eden, understanding Gan Eden in a far broader way so we can appreciate it in a far more relevant way. Okay. So he says like this now. Dehini Yadua. The Gan Eden hu gili Atzilus. Gan Eden is the revelation of the energy of Atzilus. Ukamosha Kosav. Vayita Havaya Lekim Gan Be'eden. So he already referred to it earlier on page 1211. So when you look in the Pasuk, it says that God planted in this garden the Eden. So there was an area called Eden. V'nor yotzim Eden, a river ran out from Eden, went and created a gan. That river split into four, and that created a gan, a garden, gan be'Eden, and there God planted Havaya Lekim. It doesn't say Havaya alone. It doesn't say Lekim alone, which is fascinating, because Bereshis bar Lekim, when it came to create the world, it says only Lekim. Here you have Havaya Lekim, like he says Shem Mole, Nemar Shem Mole, Havaya Lekim.
Where is it saying Havaya Lekim?
What?
Oh, Vayita Havaya Lekim Gan Be'eden.
Yeah. So it says Shem Mole, Havaya Lekim. Why Havaya Lekim? We know when you talk about the names, Bereshis bara Lekim is because the world was created with Tzimtzum. Elikim, as Rashi says, Midas Hadin. It's God concealing, God disciplining, God channeling the energy. And that's why you have, it says actually many times Elikim before you even say the first time Havaya in Chumash.
V'nohor yoytze me'eden lehashkois esagav.
What?
V'nohor yoytze me'eden lehashkois esagav.
Correct. I just said, yeah. And then Vayita, okay. So now you have like this. The Isavasa Elamis, the creation of the worlds, Hu M'Shem Elikim. That's taka from Shem Elikim, that's the Shem of Tzimtzum, concealment. The M'Shem Havaya lo yoy efshel yis Isavasa Elamis. From the name Havaya, because Havaya is divine revelation. From there, you can't have the creation of the worlds, it'd be too overwhelming. But rather, it comes from the name of Elikim that conceals and covers the energy, the revelation of Shem Havaya of Atzilus, which is the whole thing we learned earlier about Elikim being the concealment of the divine energy in existence. So Havaya is there, but it's concealed through Elikim. The Eira Atzilus bo ba'efun umuhus achar b'kamei shuba Atzilus. In other words, what Elikim does to Havaya is that it causes that the energy of Atzilus should come in a different type of personality. It comes through a type of shade, through the concealment, the way it is in its pure form in Atzilus. So let me explain what this means. So generally speaking, you speak about Havaya and Elikim, you don't always say Havaya Atzilus. But I need to emphasize that's important to remember that the reason he's saying that here, because generally speaking, and I go back, if you may recall, the topic of Atzilus the Klolis, macrocosm and microcosm. So you have Atzilus the Klolis, is generally the world of Atzilus can be looked at in two ways. Generally, Atzilus is not Bria, it's not a creation. It's imparting. God is emanating. That's why Atzilus is not called creation. It's called God is emanating, which means it's like God's attributes. So Atzmus, that's higher than Atzilus. The levels that are higher than Atzilus, you can't even define by attributes. Lav iyu midus iyu klal. God cannot be defined by any attributes. But you cannot say that the attributes are completely complete creations, like the difference between, for example, a human being's thoughts and a human being's actions. The thoughts still remain an extension of you. So when God creates, let's say, creation, these are creations. They're also God's creations, but they don't reflect in a revealed way God's personality, quote unquote. Mashenka, for example, chesed of Hashem, or rachamei Hashem, rachamim, kindness, compassion, and so on. These are reflections of divine personality. Now, of course, the Eibusha is higher than them. So Atzilus is generally considered to be Elokus, godliness. It's not Elokat, it's not God, but they're godly faculties. That's a general understanding of Atzilus. But then there's Atzilus, the Klolos, generally Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, especially the lower levels of the 10 hidden spheres, are called Atzilus, the Klolos, Atzilus in macrocosm. Bria de Klolos is already after the Tzimtzum Ak, Adam Kadman. Yitzira de Klolos is either Atik and Arich or Akudim and Akudim. And Asiya de Klolos in macrocosm is Atzilus Bria Yitzira Asiya the Proteus, because then there's a microcosm. So in microcosm, when we usually talk in Chassidus, Atzilus, we're not talking about the macrocosm, we're talking microcosm. So actually, it's all like a hologram. Everything exists within everything as it evolves downward. So you're constantly going to have all these levels. We speak about them as 4 worlds, and we speak about them in different stages. But the truth is, in every level, you have all 4 levels. So generally, we speak macrocosm, microcosm. So we talk about Atzilus in general. We say Atzilus, Chachma of Atzilus, Keser of Atzilus. We're talking microcosm, which is actually Asiya in macrocosm. Now, Atzilus of microcosm is similar to Atzilus in macrocosm because relative to the levels of Bria, Tzir, Asiya of the microcosm, Atzilus of microcosm is an emanation as opposed to a creation. So that's why when he's speaking here, Shem Havaya Atzilus, he's speaking about it in more specific terms because he's talking about the energy of Atzilus is essentially the ultimate interface, because Atzilus on one hand is not a creation, yesh ma'ayin. On the other hand, it's not pure godliness either, because it's already Atzilus, it's already emanated. The place that we find Atzilus mentioned the first time in the Torah gives us a perfect example for this. When the Jews came to Moshe and they said, we want meat. Moshe said, Ma'ayin li basar, where do I have meat? So Hashem then told him, Va'yetzal min haruach, va'atzalti min haruach, I will Atzilus, I will impart from your spirit onto the Skenim. Now, what do you need the Skenim? Why can't Moshe just be the one that gives them meat? So this is where Chassidus explains, Kabbalah explains that Atzilus is that interface, because if you went straight from God, godliness, pure godliness that's undefined and unshaped, to physical meat, it's too big of a leap. That's what Moshe was saying. Why are you coming to meat? I can teach you Torah. I'm a person that will convey to you what God wants. Why are you asking me for meat? In order to get into the structure of meat, which is the structure of existence, Atzilus is the interface. It takes from the pure spirit of Moshe. It doesn't create a new entity. It imparts from it onto the Skenim, the sages, the elders, and they become, so to speak, the ones that carry the spirit of Moshe through this interface to the lower levels, which is the ultimate, the meat that will be delivered to the Jews. Now, we've talked about this at length many, many times. I'm just going back because many of you may not remember or you didn't learn it. So earlier he said that Atzilus, without Atzilus, we would not be able to know God and we would not be able to feel God, because God and the universe, our world, would be too far apart. So Atzilus becomes the place where, in a sense, God manifests, godliness manifests in Chachma, Bina, Das. So on one hand, it's godly wisdom and intelligence, but it's already intelligence. So we learned, God is higher than intelligence as we know it. But now it's coming to Chachma, Bina, Das, and now we have we have an interface to hold on to that when we learn Torah in Biyah, in Bria, Tzir, Asiya, all the way into this world, we are connecting through the Chachma of Hashem to Hashem. So essentially, Atzilus serves like that station that it's godly, but it's a godliness in form of a structure, of Adam Elyon. When it says in the Pasuk that God created the human being in the image of God, we know God has no image. That's Atzilus. That's how God, in infinite power, created a structure of the divine as it manifests in structure. Obviously, the Eibusher is always above image, but he wanted something that we should be able to emulate. So when you say Mahu Chanon, Afatachan, just as he is kind, you'll be kind. Mahu Racham, just as he's compassionate, you shall be compassionate. If you didn't have that, we would say, how do we connect with God? God is infinite, he's beyond us. So Atzilus is ultimate interface. And that's why it's so vital to understand Atzilus well. So he's saying basically Gan Eden now is essentially the Gili of Eira Atzilus. And that's why it says Havaya Lekim. But to understand it, he's comparing it. He says like this, that the Shem Havaya of Atzilus has to go through Elikim in order to create, because if not, it will not be able to, the world cannot contain it. So the Elikim is Mailam or master on the air of Shem Havaya of Atzilus. In other words, Havaya of Atzilus is what gives Atzilus its godly personality. The air of Atzilus, but when you put it through Elikim, Atzilus is now going through a type of shade, like a sun that's being concealed through different layers. Elikim is the tzimtzum that conceals, and that allows creation to come into play. We're going to learn in a moment that Gan Eden, however, still has an element of Havaya Elikim. So it's a revelation, not just the concealment state, it also has a revelation part. Now, in the parentheses, one second.
Atzilus is in Brio, right? In Atzilus itself, it's not Atzilus. Gan Eden is in Brio.
That's what you're saying. So far, the Rebbe Rashab, I'm not commenting because we're middle of the subject. Let's see what he's going to say. Right now, he called Gilead Atzilus as Gan Eden. We'll soon see. I don't want to jump there.
When you keep mentioning Atzilus, are you talking both levels of Atzilus, or before the lower one? I keep losing it.
Here, most likely, he's talking about the lower one, but it could be also applied to the upper one.
Rabbi, forgive me, this may be incorrect, but just I'm trying to understand what you said about explaining Atzilus as a background to what we're learning. I had understood that Atzilus is completely batal to the Or Ein Sof, and in that sense, it's a mamutza, it's an interface to bring the light down through into the Bia, but Atzilus itself is, in order to be able to tolerate that great revelation, itself is batul. So how can it have structure, like you just said, all these different personality traits of the Eibishter, if it's batul to the Or Ein Sof?
What's the contradiction? Those traits are all batul to godliness.
Okay, no contradiction. Okay, thank you.
The low one is that we've always stressed as perfect balance of Oris and Kalim.
It's a perfect balance. It's the perfect quintessential faculties, but they're all absolutely, completely consumed with godliness. But it's not consumed with godliness without, there are 10 spheres in Atzilus. The higher levels beyond Atzilus don't have spheres. They don't have structure. So they can't serve as that interface. Their bittul is so deep, there's no chacham and bina das altogether there, as we learned also at length in the earlier Ayin Beis. These are the stages of the different levels of bittul. The truth is, to fully understand this well, you need to understand volume 1. And a lot of this was discussed there in detail, where he explained how Atzilus is the third lower level, is a third level of how the energy of the divine evolves. We actually learned it also at the end of volume 2, that there's stages. There's the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti as it is before the Tzimtzum, the 10 hidden spheres. There's the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti after the Tzimtzum. There's the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti in Atzilus. So I don't know if you remember, those of you we learned it together, that the truth is that the idea of godliness and the bittul to godliness depends on which level you're talking about. There are levels where it's complete bittul, where there's no room for anything, and there's levels where there's a structure, but it's batul to alakus. Okay, you know what I'm going to do? I was going to do the parentheses, but I think because of time, I'm going to stop here. So bottom line, what we learned so far is this, that Gan Eden is Gilead Atzilus, Havaya Elikim. The world itself is created only through Elikim because it has to conceal Havaya, but he's not gotten back to what Gan Eden is. That'll do after the parentheses. And then he's going to talk about what you asked about Bria, where exactly Gan Eden resides. But right now he said the revelation of Gan Eden is the revelation of Atzilus. Havaya da Atzilus, basically. So we're already starting to see that Gan Eden is is somewhat of quite a superior level. You know, I'm going to read just the parentheses because it'll like finish the subject before we go back to Gan Eden. So in the parentheses, he qualifies and says, that even though Elokim does conceal Havaya and becomes a Mahus Achar, in other words, it's like Havaya traveling through Tzimtzum. So like we learned about the Tzimtzum impacts the light. It either conceals it or it channels it. And therefore, there's a concealment. So he says, nevertheless, the concealment is only from the perspective of the recipients, of the creations. So even though it's only Legabe Nevraim, nevertheless, by Legabe Nevraim, it is a concealment. And this is what, and through that, that's what allows them to become a yesh. So even though in truth, from the point of view of the Mashpia, the creator, Atzilus, Havaya is not concealed because Havaya is still intact. It's just not, but like the teacher has all the brilliance in his mind, even though he's concealing it from the student. But from the student's point of view, there's room for him to be now an independent consciousness, an independent entity. And that's what makes him a yesh. As was explained earlier at length, in the Gvuris and Tzimtzumim of Malchus, we learned the different levels of 3 different stages of those Gvuris and Tzimtzumim. He's alluding to it here because it's part of understanding the rest of this. In other words, there are many concealments that allow the energy to be received by us. Even though the energy itself fundamentally has not been impacted, but from our point of view, it has been. So there's a real hester here. There's a real concealment from our point of view. And that's what Elokim does, but that's creation. And then he's going to say, when it comes to Gan Eden, and by Gan Eden it says the full name, not just Elokim, but Havaya Elokim, which means that in Gan Eden radiates the Eir Havaya of Atzilus. We're going to stop here, but from here he's going to explain where exactly is Gan Eden situated. The fact that Eir Havaya radiates there doesn't
say Vayita Havaya Elokim Gan Beis, even though that Meir or Havaya Vayita Havaya Elokim.
Okay, well, you know what? We're just in the middle of the subject matter, but there's the addition of Havaya. By Bereshis Bara, it doesn't say Bereshis Bara Havaya Elokim. Okay, so we're going to stop here, right after the end of that line, and then he's going to start speaking about where exactly is Gan Eden situated, that it's receiving this energy of Havaya from Atzilus. Unlike the levels of the world itself, which reads only Elokim. I should add, now I'm thinking about it, in the context of the Magid's Torah, this all is one long parenthesis where we're trying to understand how the divine, the experience of Elokus post Tzimtzum and post Parsa. Remember, there's a Parsa, a partition between Atzilus and Biyah. How do we connect back to Atzilus? So it seems to me now that I'm thinking about the Gan Eden seems to be that connection. Because Gan Eden, on one hand, is going to be lower than Atzilus, but it has the Gili of Atzilus. As opposed to the worlds themselves, where only Elokim dominates. So he's going to explain how Gan Eden, Giluyim of Gan Eden, that come afterwards. Okay, fine. So we'll stop here. Anybody has any questions you want to ask?
I just want to, it's amazing that other B'chavas could ever make a chait with that, with such a level of existence. I can't, it's just absolutely amazing.
Well, shortly we're going to meet them, I'm sure, at Chis HaMesim, and you could ask them how they did it.
Rabbi, can you track? I'm sorry, maybe I should go back and. But
just one second. Let me stop the recording. 1 second here. Stop. Okay, go ahead. What's your question?
I'd have to go back and listen to like the past week of Shiurim, I think, to answer my own question. Maybe you can do it in a regular achas. How did we get from Ayin Od to here? How did we get from the idea that Elokim, that in this material world, Gashmias is going to radiate its own its own or a helem. How did we get from there to Gan Eden? And what's the connection?
Maybe there is no connection at this point. He says to understand the subject matter, he started with Havaya Yichatu Mirivav on page 1210. He asked a bunch of questions about God, about the shattering of God's foes and enemies. And then he said, Lahavin Kalzeh, to understand all this, let's begin by understanding the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haba. So there was no apparent connection. I did explain it in previous classes where it's going, but he didn't make a connection yet. He just, as I said, in this type of Chassidus, this happens all the time. To understand one thing, he goes to another subject and gives a whole overview and a discussion, then we'll come back to understand where we are.
Okay, thank you.